Women with autism, this is you.
When you look with your eyes, everything seems nice.
My ability to memorize things very quickly, notice details that nobody else noticed. You know, all of these things I went, I'm a bit of a superwoman. Suddenly, now, you're in this book.
I need the labels to stop. I need your eyebrows to drop.
Really, welcome to Divided. A real pleasure to meet you, actually. For those of our viewers who don't know you, how would you describe yourself?
My name's Ria Lina. I am ethnically Filipino and German, but I was born here in the UK. My parents are Dutch. I'm a stand-up comic. I work in cabaret, theater, acting, and I'm also autistic.
That's a backstory and a half in a few words.
Certainly Phil's 20-minute comedy set. I'll say that. Yeah.
Well, just on that, actually, many people will hear the phrase stand-up comic and autism and find it quite difficult to reconcile the two.
I think less so now. I think more and more in the community, people are going, oh, that's why I'm good at this. Because we are different, you know, we see things differently, we think things differently, and also I think just the experience you had through childhood that sets you apart slightly, that makes you slightly other. I'm finding more and more of my colleagues are either being diagnosed or coming out. So it's not, those two things together are not as uncommon as we might have first thought. We used to associate comedians with being depressive or generally having some kind of mental health issue, which we feel that we sort of debunked towards the end of the 90s, but now this is coming in no way as a negative, but just as a, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
I need the labels to stop. I need your eyebrows to drop. What I really need is for you to off. Your special needs keep you in chains. When mine get me free rides on trains.
Well, explain the sense behind it, because obviously there is a spectrum of autism, and there's high functioning and less so. What is it about autism that you think, or about your autism, that has contributed? What is it about the background that has set you up for this career?
I think that's a really good point. Yes, autism is a spectrum, so we aren't speaking about the entire spectrum. I certainly can't speak for the entire spectrum. I can only speak from my point of view and the way that's affected me. It certainly has always determined the way that I think, the way that I process information, the way that I might say something that you shouldn't say. I've had a lot of good friends over the years that will go, okay, that was funny, but you know you can't say that in general public. Going, okay, noted. But for whatever reason, you say it on stage and everyone goes, oh, she speaks the truth. It's so funny. And I think that's one of the things that comedy is. Comedy is about saying the things that everybody thought, but nobody said out loud, especially if you're talking about political or social commentary.
Immigration's at a high, oh why would I want to vote anyone else? Internet is full of spies, oh why would I want to vote anyone else? When you look with your eyes, everything seems nice, but if you look twice, it's all pies in the skies.
Contrary to popular belief, people think that people with autism don't have a sense of humor or don't understand humor, when in quite the opposite way. I find that especially people who identify with having Asperger's actually are quite dry and wry and incredibly witty. Because of the way that they've noticed things that other people don't, or they don't take for granted social norms that maybe the rest of the community would.
See, I can understand why it could be incredibly beneficial for the career on the stage. I can also imagine that it might have been quite difficult, particularly when you were growing up and perhaps before you realising that you were autistic.
There was no realization until I was well into adulthood for me. Although when you get diagnosed, and part of that process was, you know, I have 2 children that are diagnosed, is they look at the family history because it is understood to be a familial trait that can be passed down. And then when we looked backwards on my family history, just went, oh, how did we not spot that my computer programming mother, and to be a computer programmer in the, in the 60s, 70s, for anyone was unique, but for a small Filipino woman was unheard of. You're going, I think there were signs that it existed in the family. But growing up, it's what I find fascinating, and these are the things that I don't think you can scientifically put your finger on, but if you speak to a lot of people growing up as children, a lot of people with autism describe feeling like an alien. You just sort of don't feel the same as everybody else around you. And they also don't feel that you're the same. It works both ways. There are a number of times where the way I would describe it is that if you were in an emergency, any kind of crisis, then each would save their own. Mm-hmm. If you had a room full, or you had, a room full of what we would call neurotypicals and Ts and autistic people, they would each save their own. And that's when you would discover how instinctive the feeling of different is between, I'll say, communities again, between two
because
communities.
for all the talk about being a rebellious youth and all the rest of it, a large part of growing up comes from, a lot of the pressure comes from your peer group to conform to certain norms. And if you're seeing the world in a different way, that possibly doesn't make it as easy.
There is a lot of pressure to conform, and I think it affects different people growing up in different ways. Because I was so clearly other and so clearly different, I went the other way and just went, I don't have to conform. I am not like you. I don't have to, look at you all feeling so pressured into drinking early or having boyfriends and girlfriends. I need none of this. But it is, at the same time, very lonely. You own it. You own it because if you don't own it, it's forced upon you. Mm. At least in my experience. So I was very much, I would choose to stand to the side before I got pushed to the side.
You said that you didn't, the realization of the autism didn't come until quite late. I mean, a lot of people it is identified early. I mean, tell us about that, when that happened. I mean, it was a gig, I believe.
Well, autism was not spoken about in my childhood. It was not a known thing. It wasn't really conversed about publicly in the 80s and 90s, but nor did we have the internet, nor did we have the ability to, spread information the way that we do now. So it was in my 20s that I started to hear about it and read about it and going, this rings a bell. This is vibrating on the right frequency for me. When you hear something, you go, oh, that feels right. And I had very strong suspicions. But I was actually at the end of a gig, and it was actually a cabaret gig. So there was nothing, it was not in any way mentioned in the gig. We were all performing and singing and dancing and larking about. And afterwards, someone came up to me, and in their very Aspergic way, because they're also autistic, and they work with the NAS, which is the National Autistic Society. They came up to me and just went, you're autistic. No, hey, I enjoyed that, because we don't do pleasantries. Just, you're autistic. And I went, oh, hello to you too. I hope you enjoyed the show. And that kind of went, okay, now I've had this external confirmation from a complete stranger at the time who had used his, we call it a-dar. So you've got a-dar, you've got a-dar, and a-dar is definitely a thing where you can walk into a room and go, you don't know it, but you're on the spectrum.
So what effect did that have? I mean, it didn't force you to change your personality type, it just maybe
Well, no, that made me go and look into getting, that made me go and seek out diagnosis, and made me go and, initially to the doctor, to the GP, if anyone wonders the route, and just, you can do it privately as well, and just say, look, I've always struggled with A, B, and C. I think it might be this, and going forward from there to find out that it was that.
And from that point on, from what I understand, you started to include some kind of nods towards disability in your sets.
Well, slowly but surely. I think that when you're a comedian, you write about what's in your head. Mm-hmm. Anyone creative will, if you're an artist of any kind, you're trying to process the conversation in your head. And I have a lot of conversations going on in my head at the same time. And so that was obviously very prominent. I went from, just diagnosis, and it's a very strange concept because you are autistic no matter what. You're born autistic and you are autistic for life, but it's only when a medical professional sort of green lights you that you're allowed to say that you are. And you suddenly go from being normal or just a member of the community to being special. It's just you were the same person you were before, but suddenly you've got a label and you've got a different parking space, and it all changes just with one doctor or a series of doctors going tick, 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 boom, you're over here. Because it's a hidden disability, it's known as a hidden disability. You can't see it. Some, obviously there's some that you can see it straight away, and people will recognize that. And for some, you have to go through a process. But for me to suddenly in one day, with one couple of pieces of paperwork, to go from being from here to being special. And you just go, what? So that was a lot for me to process, because also everything that I thought did make me special, everything, you know, my ability to process information, my ability to memorize things very quickly, notice details that nobody else noticed, do mathematical equations in my head, you know, all of these things. I went, oh, I'm a bit of a superwoman. Suddenly, now you're in this book. Here you go. Here's an entire book, you know, women with autism. This is you. This is how you deal with relationships. This is how you deal with sensory issues. Suddenly I wasn't me anymore. Everything that I had identified as Ria Lina, that, okay, fine, I'm not like the rest of you, I'm not getting asked to prom, but I've got these skills, was textbook, and I'd lost myself.
There was one thing that you wrote, and I think that I just wanted to get your view on this. You wrote about moving from Ria to autistic Ria to now Ria with autism. And I just wonder, as we kind of look at this whole conversation in the round, how much of you is your autism compared to, for example, your ethnicity, compared to you kind of the moving around when you were younger? How
That's
much?
tricky to unpick, isn't it? It's really tricky to unpick, because I definitely identify as an Asian woman, but I'm not an Asian woman with a strong cultural connection, because my mother herself wasn't raised in the Philippines. She was raised in the US as an American. But I identify very strongly with a lot of the traits that we associate with being Asian. But if you start to look at this, there's a lot of overlap between what we associate with the Asian mind, the mathematics and the efficiency, you know, and the abilities, the musical abilities, for example, you know, the academic abilities. But then if you switch over, my father's German, and we associate that with the Germans as well. They're very efficient, and they're very good at you know, at their economics and their math. And then you switch again, and you go, well, hang on a second, what do we associate with high functioning autistics? Often, and often erroneously, you know, people like Sheldon on The Big Bang Theory don't necessarily help with that stereotype, but they're very good at physics, and they're very good at science, and they're very good. So all three of those identities kind of mish together into you know, why aren't I a math professor in, you know, at Oxford? You know, I was like my daughter, I was also advanced. I also was a year ahead in school. My mother was a year ahead in school. So I think all of that, it's very tricky to separate sometimes the autism from the Asian, from the German, but then my mother is also an Asian autistic, and that would be why she was advanced at school, and a physicist and a computer programmer. I think that this is what I was talking about. You lose yourself for a year and go, what's me and what's the condition? And then eventually you go, no, the condition is a part of who I am, the way that I have brown hair and I have brown eyes and I have an autistic brain. And you accept it as part of who you are.
We're all very complicated Venn diagrams, aren't we?
Love a Venn diagram.
Ria Lina, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thanks for joining us on Divided.
Thank you.